Okay, so now we're going to talk about the appraisal contingency part of the purchase contract. As you can see right here, the appraisal contingency essentially talks about we're going to offer to buy the home for $250,000. The bank or your lender is going to do an appraisal on that property to verify the value that the price you're offering is fair market value. So the appraisal contingency, generally speaking, you're going to have down here line number 14. We're going to say we will have that appraisal contingency met by 15 calendar days. We need to have that appraisal done and back within that 15 calendar days. Now, there is no set time for that. You can do 15 days, 10 days, 21 days. Generally, a good rule of thumb is 15 days to 20 days. We want to make sure we give the bank, the appraiser, plenty of time to get that appraisal in. Now, if we've offered to buy the home for $250,000 and the appraisal comes back at value, we're good to go. We continue to move forward with the transaction. If for some reason, well, let me re-clarify that. If it comes in at $250,000 or above, we're good, we move forward. Where we start to get into a little bit of sticky, water, if you will, is if the appraisal comes in below that $250,000. So for our example, let's say we offer to buy it for $250,000. The appraisal comes in at $240,000. That's $10,000 below what we've offered to buy. Now, some buyers are going to say, oh my gosh, I don't want to pay more than what the house is worth. I always let them know, hey, Mr. Buyer, you're going to have an appraisal done by your lending institution, the bank that's doing your loan. They're not going to lend you more than what the home is worth. So I always like to use the term safety net. The appraisal is your safety net to ensure you're not overpaying for that home. Make sense? Great. Now, during that time frame, if the value comes below the $250,000, so for our example, we'll say $240,000, there's a $10,000 shortfall there. There's going to be a few different options, and this is where your negotiation skills come in. So we're going to go to the seller and say, Mr. Seller, here's a copy of the appraisal. It's appraised at $240,000. We'd like you to reduce that purchase price to the $240,000 so we can continue to move forward. Now, I do have to let you know, market conditions can dictate how those negotiations go. When I say market conditions, maybe we're in a very aggressive seller's market where properties are flying off the shelf, people are fighting over those. That might dictate the seller's going to be a little more aggressive in their pricing and may not want to reduce the price. But we'll ask, reduce the sales price to the $240,000. Seller agrees, we get an addendum, reducing that price, we move forward with the transaction. Number two, maybe the seller says, well, I don't want to reduce it 10 grand. How about I reduce it 5 grand? And the buyer brings an additional $5,000 to the table. What you need to understand there is that the buyer needs to have those financial resources to be able to bring in that additional money to compensate for that shortfall. Number three, seller says, hey, great market, I'm not reducing it. Your buyer brings in that $10,000 difference, or we don't have a deal. Again, does your buyer have the resources to do so? And do they want to do that? Finally, we can't come to an agreement. We cancel the transaction based on the appraisal contingency. We move forward to look to another property. If, as an agent, you come across the appraisal contingency issues, which you will throughout your career, you want to be a strong negotiator on your client's behalf so that we can maneuver through that contingency. Let's move on. So we've talked about appraisal contingencies. Line 18, loan contingency. You're probably saying, loan contingency, well, they're approved. They are approved. However, during that escrow period, as the lender takes a deeper dive into the buyer's financial capabilities and buying power, if you will, things can pop up. So, perfect example. We don't ever want this to happen to you, but my first year in real estate 20 years ago, super excited, have a buyer, is qualified, we get a home under contract. My client is so excited, he goes out to a furniture store, takes out a loan and buys a whole house full of furniture for his new home. What happened was, now with all this extra debt on his credit, that threw his DTI, or debt to income ratio, out of whack. Now what happens? Buyer has a bunch of furniture, no house to put it in because now the buyer couldn't qualify. Do you want to think about how I felt as an agent as being incompetent? My buyer was pretty upset about that. So we want to make sure during our contingency period on that loan, we advise our buyers. And most competent lenders, if you will, are going to advise your client the same way. Hey, don't go out and make any big purchases. Don't buy a new car. Don't do this or that, because we don't want anything to jeopardize you being qualified for the loan. Now, if you want to do that after you close escrow on your new home and you've got the financial wherewithal to do it, feel free. But going back to the loan contingency here, guys, again, we have a timeline. We will provide no later than X amount of calendar days to say, hey, we're fully approved, let's go. If you remember on the appraisal contingency for our example, we said, hey, we'll have an appraisal done within 15 calendar days. Now, one of the biggest mistakes I see, so we did 15 calendar days, and over here, the buyer agent says 12 days. I very well can't have a loan approval if I don't have an appraisal already. So this timeline is generally going to be longer than the appraisal contingency. So if we have a 15 calendar day appraisal contingency, probably going to have about a 20 to 21 day loan contingency. All the financials have been verified by the lender, the appraisal's back at value, or we've negotiated that. Now we're good. We've got our loan contingency released. We can continue to move forward. We're getting close to the escrow and handing out those keys. Right here you're going to see, is this a cash purchase? What you need to understand, in a cash purchase, there's no need for a lender. There's no requirement for an appraisal. However, your buyer may want to have an appraisal. Okay? If it is a cash purchase, you'll see here, within X amount of business days of acceptance, buyer agrees to provide written proof of funds available. My experience, to put your client in the best possible position to win, you're already going to want to have that done presenting the offer. Why would myself as a seller accept the cash offer without any proof that the buyer actually has that cash to follow through on the contract? So in best practices, I generally put done. Here's our offer. Here's my client's proof of funds to purchase that property. Sale of another property. Now, this is another contingency if your client has a property they need to sell. So I live in property A, but I need the money out of that home to buy property B, or I have the money but I can't qualify on my debt to income carrying two mortgages. If that is something that is the case with your buyer, then you're going to absolutely want to put this agreement is, if it's not contingent, or if it is, then we're going to have a separate addendum stating why they need to be contingent. Fixtures and personal property, line 33. Now, you need to pay close attention to this. A lot of times as we go through a home, clients are like, oh boy, I really like that stainless steel dishwasher. Oh, I love that stainless steel refrigerator. Or, my most recent one I've dealt with, I love that chandelier, right? You need to be clear, and we're going to jump to the next slide here. Right here, the following additional items of personal property. Now, what we want to do in there is we actually want to itemize the items that our buyer wants. Buyer wants that stainless steel refrigerator. Buyer wants that chandelier. If you fail to itemize those on line 42 here, guys, you're setting yourself up for failure and maybe even writing a check. My most recent example of this is, buyer came in, loved this beautiful chandelier. Nowhere in the contract Buyer wanted it. Seller failed to say, no, that chandelier is excluded. At the final walkthrough, the buyer shows up, notices that the chandelier has gone and been replaced with something inferior. At that point in time, I received a call from the other broker, said, hey, this wasn't anywhere stated that it was excluded. My buyer wants that chandelier. Unfortunately, the seller was not willing to relinquish that chandelier. However, we did come to as you remember earlier, a monetary amount for the inconvenience of that happening. So please be very detailed in regards to what your buyer wants in that home. The other thing to keep in mind is maybe on that MLS listing, the seller says, no, this is not included. You can still ask for it, but remember, they probably aren't going to go ahead and give it to you. Now, opening escrow. Hallelujah. We have an accepted contract. Now, in this line here, right, this is where once we have that accepted, I jumped ahead. Once we have an accepted contract, this talks about who's going to handle that process for us. Some states utilize a title escrow company. Other states use a real estate attorney. Generally, that is where the earnest money deposit is going to go. They're basically going to do what is required state law to convey property from one entity to another. So we're going to note here that I want to use ABC Title or Escrow Company with Susie Q, Escrow Officer. We want to make sure that we talk about that there. Now that is another line that you'll see that will be negotiated a lot of times in the contract. Just so that you're clear, you can ask for your title and escrow company if you have a preferred rep or your buyer has a preferred company, but that is always open for negotiation. As you'll see here, line 54, upon acceptance, buyer's earnest money showed at page 1 shall be deposited to the language in section 1A, escrow holder, title, and escrow. Generally speaking, that will be deposited to the title company that we've agreed upon. Close of escrow date. This is the date that the buyer and seller agree upon that we're going to close escrow. The deal's done. So we're going to put in here, and as you'll notice, shall be on or before such and such date. So if we'd agreed upon, we're going to close escrow March 30th, but hey, you know what? We're ready by the 23rd of March. The seller's okay with it, the buyer's okay with it. We can proceed to close further without having to write up any additional documentation because the verbiage says on or before. Line 6, IRS disclosure. This is generally going to be something that will be applicable to the seller. Are there, anything that needs to be reported to the IRS will be done so through escrow. Number 11, title insurance. This purchase agreement is contingent, all right, upon the seller's ability to deliver good and marketable title. What do we mean by that? We don't want our buyer taking ownership of a property that maybe has mechanics liens, IRS liens, things that might cloud that title and cause our client, trouble in the future. So we will, during that due diligence period, get what's called a preliminary title report. We'll review that title report to look for any of those discrepancies that might be there. And if we do find those, make sure we bring it to the attention to the title escrow officer, to the seller, and how are those going to be resolved. Okay, next item on the contract, line 16, item 7. We're going to talk about buyer's due diligence. You'll also see there it says buyer's obligation is or is not conditioned as buyer's due diligence on the property. Generally speaking, in a purchase contract, we're going to have that timeline. Number one, we are going to make it contingent, right? We want to make sure the property appraises, make sure if there's any home inspection issues, things of that nature, review the title report. For most contracts, you're going to see that due diligence period be anywhere from 10 days to maybe 15 calendar days. What we want to do, again, during that due diligence period is to ensure we're conveying the property to the buyer free and clear of any liens, encumbrances on the home. We've conducted a home inspection on the property. The buyer's accepted the inspection, or we've come to some negotiations with the seller in regards to any repairs that may need to be done. And as you'll see when we move down the contract, right here, line 23, property inspections and conditions. During the due diligence period, buyer shall take actions to conduct a home inspection. Now, sometimes the buyers are going to say, well, I really don't want to, we've walked through the house, it looks really good. I always recommend a buyer have a home inspection. And why do we do that? Well, number one, there could be problems or defects with the home that aren't apparent to the naked eye. So we want to have a professional licensed home inspector to come in to conduct that home inspection. Generally speaking, they're going to do an inspection of the exterior roof, in the attics, basically the functioning mechanical, structural functions of the home to ensure that your buyer's going into it knowing what they're getting into, so to speak. Now, during that inspection, you're always going to come up with something that is not quite right. And based on that, we're going to take that home inspection report with a list of, hey, these are the items we'd like to see fixed, and we're going to send that over to the seller. Negotiation period will take place. They're going to fix everything we've asked for. They're only going to fix a few things, or we're not fixing anything. But that's why we want to have a home inspection. Buyer's right to cancel or resolve objections. That's going to be line B here. During that due diligence period, we need to provide the seller written notice. We want these items fixed. If for some reason we can't come to an agreement during that time period, per the contract, and within that 15 calendar days for our example, we have the right to cancel that contract. And we would be entitled to get our earnest money deposit back. Line 50, item C. Failure to cancel. Now, if for some reason you don't adhere to that 15-day timeline and you haven't given the seller written response, the seller deems that the buyer is approved and accepted as is. I can't stress the importance enough here that you have to provide something in writing to that seller so that they understand, hey, yes, I'm okay with it, or no, I'm not, and this is what I need to take place to remedy that. If you fail to do that, not only are you going to put your buyer in a possible situation to lose their earnest money deposit if they choose to cancel, but you could also open yourself up to possible legal and or violations with the division or your local association. So please make sure you adhere to those timelines to keep your buyer in the best position. Inspections. Again, it's accepted, it's contingent upon us having that inspection done within that time frame. And we go to continue here. It talks a little bit more about when we provide that inspection within 2 days after acceptance until close of escrow.